Good evening. My name is Nichelle Holmes, and I am the current president of the illustrious Charles Houston Bar Association. And I would like to welcome you, everyone, in tonight. I'm so excited about our program tonight. We have an amazing panel as well as two amazing, outstanding moderators. Let me just first start by saying that I'm humbled to be a part of this collaboration and so many outstanding organizations that have come together to have this very real and sometimes tough conversation about how we build a coalition for racial justice and the civil rights during a time of crisis. I am a firm believer that it will take a collaborative effort in order to affect real change in racial equality in all institutions in this country. At this time, because our time is very limited, I am going to introduce our dynamic moderators for this evening. First, we have Mr. Will Mosley. He is a senior counsel in the Global Litigation and Investigations team at Allied Materials. In this role, he is responsible for managing and conducting offensive and defensive investigation, litigation, and pre-litigation matters worldwide, with an emphasis on the protection and applied intellectual property. Will currently oversees a variety of litigation matters concerning trade secrets, general commercial disputes, and tort matters in the US as well as overseas. But more importantly, in my opinion, Will is the 2020 president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Silicon Valley. He has been an active member of APABA Silicon Valley since he entered the legal profession and has served on the board of directors since 2013. Next, we have Mr. Terrance J. Evans, who is my favorite person. He is a partner at both in San Francisco and the Los Angeles office of Duane Morris, LLP, where he serves as the vice chair of the firm's banking practice for the Western United States. He is also the co-chair of Duane Morris, the San Francisco Division's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. His practice is focused on representing the financial services industry, which includes international, national, and community banks, loan service companies, and insurance companies. During his career, Mr. Evans has recovered and saved clients of his firm tens of millions of dollars in settlements, judgment, and extrajudicial procedures. Terrance is the chair-elect of the litigation section of the CLA. He is my vice president this year of the Charles Houston Bar Association, and God willing, the future president, if I have anything to do with it. He is the co-chair of the ABA ICLC Diversity and Inclusion Committee. He is the executive board member of the Bar Association of San Francisco. He is the co-founder of CLA Racial Justice Committee. He is the deputy director of Region 9 of the National Bar Association and on the advisory board member of MCCA. He receives numerous awards and honor during his career. He is a dedicated and passionate servant. And with that, I will turn you over to our moderators.
Thank you very much, Nichelle. And also I want to thank everybody for being here and being part of this program. We're so excited to share this information with you about racial justice. Before we begin, I just want to make folks aware about two events that we have coming up in the next few weeks. The next program that we have is our October 9th program. It will be from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. Pacific, and it is going to be about reparations. And we're joining with many of the organizations that are sponsoring this event. The program will be moderated by Adrieannette Ciccone, who is part of this amazing program. And we have the honor of having Dr. Nicholas Baham of the California State University East Bay. So please feel free to join that information. We'd love to have you. And then our next program after that will be on October 15, 2020 from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. It will be our citywide diversity and inclusion program hosted by Dwayne Morris and in partnership with Charles Houston Bar Association, CLA Racial Justice Committee, the University of San Francisco, and several other organizations, including East Bay La Raza. The speakers for that event will be Ona DeSumo, the CEO and Executive Director of CLA, Stuart Plunkett, who was the President of the Bar Association of San Francisco, the incredible and amazing Nichelle Holmes, who just made these introductions, who's President of Charles Houston Bar Association, April Smith, Executive Director for East Bay La Raza, and Dr. Kenneth Monteiro, the Acting Director of the Cesar Chavez Institute and the former Dean of the College of Ethnic Studies. So we look forward to you joining those programs. Will.
Thank you, Terrance. I would also like to take a moment to acknowledge all of our many sponsors for this evening's event. It's a long list, so bear with me. The Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Silicon Valley, Charles Houston Bar Association, Region 9 of the National Bar Association, the National Asian Pacific Islander Prosecutors Association, the Chinese American Lawyers of the Bay Area, the Asian American Criminal Trial Lawyers Association, the Filipino Bar Association of Northern California, the Vietnamese American Bar Association of Northern California, the Asian American Bar Association of the Greater Bay Area, the South Asian Bar Association of Northern California, the Korean American Bar Association of Northern California, Bay Area Lawyers for Individual Freedom, the National Asian Pacific Islander Prosecutors Association, and the Asian American Prosecutors Association. So many thanks to all of these wonderful organizations for supporting this event. I also want to point out that to the extent you have questions during this program, please do feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And, Terrance and I will review your questions. And if we have the ability to ask them during this discussion, we will certainly do so. So with that, I would like to do a quick introduction for our panelists. I'll start with Ruthe Ashley. Ruthe is the Executive Director Emeritus at California Law, an organization that aims to diversify California's legal profession by creating a pipeline of students from high schools, community colleges, undergraduate institutions, and law schools into law or law-related careers. In 2014, she became the first Filipina and second Asian Pacific American woman elected to the ABA Board of Governors. She is a former chair of the State Bar of California Diversity Pipeline Task Force and helped create its Council on Access and Fairness.
And I have the great honor of introducing Professor Maria Ontiveros. Professor Ontiveros is one of the foremost Latina professors in the United States. I had the honor of doing a racial justice program with her a few years ago, and I'm so grateful that she accepted our invitation. She is a professor and Dean's Circle Scholar at the University of San Francisco Law School. She focuses her scholarly work on employment law with an emphasis on immigration workers' rights. She has published numerous articles and books, including The History of Immigrant Workers, Workplace Harassment of Women of Color, Organized Labor, and the 13th Amendment. She speaks all over the country, and we're so glad that she can join us virtually. Thank you so much, Professor Ontiveros. And in addition to that, I have the honor of introducing my good friend, Adrieannette Ciccone, who is a past board member of the Bar Association, of the Charles Houston Bar Association, and she is the co-founder and really the energy behind the California Lawyers Association Racial Justice Committee. And for those of you who don't know, this organization since March has facilitated, participated in more than 50 racial justice events with organizations all over the United States, and she has been behind all of that. Just an incredible woman who has been recognized by the National Bar Association as one of the top 40 attorneys in the United States under the age of 40, recognized as one of the best advocates in the United States by the National Bar Association. She was selected by the Minority Bar Coalition in 2019 for her work on diversity and inclusion, and has been nominated again this year as one of the top lawyers in the state of California focused on issues of diversity and inclusion. So Adrieannette, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and being part of this event. We'll now get right into the questions, and I'll just say as a preliminary matter, our decision to have this event was inspired in part by the events that many of us have seen in the news regarding racial justice and diversity and inclusion. And for me personally, this is not just another news story. It is not just something that we see in the media. It's something that has personal importance to me. I have been the victim of racial profiling and injustice. And so this is something that is passionate for me and for all of us. And so getting into our first question, I'd like to ask the panel, what are some of the ways that we can build alliances on issues of racial justice, diversity, and inclusion? And I'll direct that to Professor Ontiveros.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to chat with everybody, because I do think that conversation and talking and understanding the lived experiences that various peoples of color have is one of the main things that we need to do in order to build bridges and in order to build coalitions, because I think we all experience life in a different way and experience subordination in a different way. And if we can listen and talk in a constructive way, I think that's incredibly important. I also personally think that right now, one of the things that I'm finding myself doing is recognizing a need to step back. I think for the first time, we are really, as a country, putting a very strong focus on anti-Black racism. And I think it's really key that we allow there to be a moment, at least a moment, where that issue and that form of racism steps to the forefront, and that we don't try to compete necessarily for the same space for that. So those are two things that I would mention as ways to start to build bridges and coalitions.
And Ruthe, can you add some thoughts to that issue? Some of the ways that our respective communities, Black, Latino, Asian Pacific, can support each other during these very difficult times.
Thank you, Terrance. And this is something that really hits me deeply. I just want to share an experience that I had when I was in law school, and that was a long, long time ago, of course, over 30 years ago. And I was still a second-year law student, and it was 1986. And in Sacramento at that time, there were no Asian Pacific American judges. And a wonderful thing happened. The three presidents of the three local ethnic bar associations, the La Raza Bar Association, Wiley Manuel, and the Asian Bar Association, were friends. And they were sitting around talking about how they could initiate change. There was a Latino judge, there was an African-American judge, but there were no Asian judges. And for the first time in the history of Sacramento, and as far as I knew, the three got together and said, let's form something that we can work on together, a project that we will first work on getting a first Asian judge, and then we will continue to work on this and really make things and do things together and do our priorities, all helping each other. That was in 1986. They had their first dinner in 1987. And now it has been going for all these years, and they still do those same things. I think in many of the areas now in Southern California, there's the Minority Bar Coalition. In the Bay Area, there's another Minority Bar Coalition. But the three ethnic bars, and they've included women, LGBT bars, Saba bars, Vietnamese bars, all the national ethnic bars have really joined together. And I think working together on projects that have priorities that are focused on different areas really help in the different specific events that happen. So now that the foundation is there and the structure is there, these minority bar coalitions can get together and say, okay, this is something that we really need to focus on, this systemic racism that affects everyone. It not only affects our Black brothers and sisters in a very, very serious and personal way, but in essence, it affects all of us as people of color. And I think that was one good way of starting to work together. The word collaboration is very important. And the word collaboration means working together, understanding each other, talking to each other, and walking that walk, and really understanding the kinds of situations you've been in, Terrance, for all your life, the kinds of situations that Nichelle has been in, the kinds of situations that I, even though I have been discriminated and stereotyped against, I really think I know, but I don't really understand until I talk to you one-on-one about what's going on in your lives.
And Adrieannette, can you add to that discussion regarding some of the ways, especially with the many events that you've had the opportunity to participate in and the different communities that you've spoken to, some of the ways that we can work together and support each other?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for the kind and gracious introduction, Terrance. You're always on it. But ways that we can collaborate, I think that the very fact that we're having this conversation right now, and the conversation is including a wide range of people, that is a start to hopefully a much better end for all of us, and especially to combat the high level of anti-Black racism that exists not just in the United States, but outside of the United States, in various Latin American countries, in Africa perhaps, and even going up towards Europe, right? So the point that we're having the conversation is a great place to start. But I think that one thing that we must keep in mind is that we have to do more than just talk. So the first level of consciousness about an issue is just being informed and reading as much as you can and talking to as many people as Ruthe mentioned to understand people's experiences. But then you have to say, okay, I have all this information. Now, what am I going to do? And as attorneys who are really, in the words of Charles Hamilton Houston, either agents of social change or parasites, it's up to us to be agents of social change and to move forward. And so moving forward, what does that look like? I, unfortunately, am still trying to figure that out, and I don't have all the answers, but I think moving forward looks like a policy that takes race and the historical discrimination of race of people, and also people's gender and their economic situation into consideration. So looking at policies that will really help people who have been historically marginalized, people who have been disenfranchised for centuries. I also think that another way we can work on this is not only just with the policies, but as our Racial Justice Legislative Committee is doing, is really creating legislation and supporting legislation that will support policies that are anti-racist and that are going to promote a more equitable, inclusive environment. Beyond those two things, I think that in light of the deaths that have come to light at the hands of police, really understanding what happens whenever a police officer commits an act like that, and also who is really behind the police departments, looking at police commissions, holding police officers and commissions and their unions accountable. So policy, legislation, and holding people who have a lot of contact with people that look like me or everyone else on this panel accountable. And really not only just making sure that they're being held accountable, and not even making sure that we have a seat at the table, right? Also looking at, why is the table the way it is? Reconstructing the table for me. So that's what I envision, and I'm still trying to figure out, again, how all of these things can play out. But that's my idea for what we can do.
Right, and I think one thing,
go ahead.
One thing to also add to that is, building on some of Ruthie's work, is just making sure that there are more of us. I did a panel down for it was the future of Latinas in the United States. I was doing a panel down in the South. And this wasn't a strictly legal panel, but a lot of the suggestions that came forward were more Latinx teachers, more candidates for all levels of government, more professors, more judges, that we all come from such a varied background, and there's so much diversity within our communities. But if there can be more of us, in the key positions so that we can be appointed to the police commissions, so that we can be the politicians who shape policy. You know, and as Ruthe would say, it begins quite young. You know, more teachers of color mentoring our youngsters so that they can get to where we are. I think that's something that we can all agree on as a good idea, and that we want to see more people from all our various backgrounds in these positions of power.
And I just wanted to add, before we get to the next question, 3 examples from my own life where I've experienced systematic racism, because I think a lot of folks talk about it. There are people who don't believe that it's real. They think it's something that they've just seen on TV, but I've experienced it, and my position as a partner at a major law firm has not insulated me from that. So I'll just give 3 very quick examples. When I was in law school, and I've shared this with some other folks, I was in my first year of law school. I was in a coffee shop in Los Angeles with my laptop and all my law books, minding my own business. And 4 police officers came in the coffee shop, and they soon were joined by others. It was about 12 police officers. 4 of them had guns pointed directly at my head, and they said that I fit the description of somebody who had robbed a store. And I was trying to explain to them that I was just a law student. I was studying for a final exam, and I was just there minding my own business, but they still continued to keep the guns pointed at my head. And I knew that at any minute, if I made any sudden move, they would pull the trigger and that would be it. So trying to calm them down during that situation, trying to reason with these officers that I was not a threat, and trying to also demonstrate proof that I was a law student. I remember my law school ID was in my wallet in my right front pocket. I was afraid to reach for it because I didn't want them to think I had a weapon. So talking to these officers, saying, I'm just a law student, I have my law school ID in my right front pocket, I don't want to be killed in this coffee shop, I can show you my ID if you can allow me to reach for my wallet. It was a very emotional, it was a very difficult moment. I thought I was going to die in that situation. And for 30 minutes, I was detained by those police officers until they concluded that I was not the guy they were looking for. Another very quick example, I have been stopped multiple times because I drive a nice car. And I remember one incident, I was actually on my way to a bar association meeting where I'm on the executive board. An officer pulled me over, he had his hand on his gun, and he asked me how could I possibly have afforded that car and where did I get the car from? And I tried to explain to him, I am a partner at a law firm. I can afford this car. I purchased this car with my money. Still had his hand on his gun, and trying to calm that police officer down, knowing that if I made any sudden movements, if I reached for anything, if I did anything, I would be dead. And I would be just like everybody else that you've seen on the television. And then finally, and I can give you numerous examples because it's something I live with constantly, I was at the Sonoma County Superior Court to argue a dispositive motion in a high-profile case. I was dressed in a nice gray suit. I was looking pretty good, at least I thought to myself. The sheriff's deputy, as I came in, pulled me over and asked me what I was doing there. I said, I'm an attorney, I'm here, I have an oral argument before Judge so-and-so. He said, I don't believe you're a lawyer. I think that you are probably a criminal. I know your type. And I was detained for over 2 hours. I missed my oral argument because he didn't believe I was an attorney. I told him, you can Google my name. I'm all over the internet. You can find that I am a real lawyer. And he would not even listen to anything that I said. To make a long story short, I ultimately spoke with the judge who said she would do something about it. I don't know if she did. The judge actually ruled in our favor even without my argument based on the paper. So that was a good sign. But these are the types of indignities that I and many Black men, regardless of how educated we are, regardless of how much money we make, regardless of what kind of positions we hold in bar associations, we experience this kind of racism on a daily basis. So when we hear about the George Floyds, when we hear about Breonna Taylor, it's a visceral response because this is part of our daily life. And that's why we're having this discussion.
Can I just add something? And I think the trauma of those experiences, because you are then expected to continue to study for your bar, your exam. You're expected to perform well. You're expected to go back to work today. Like, nobody ever addresses the mental health of those traumatic experiences. And that's what you experienced as an educated well off. I don't want to say rich because I don't know what your pockets look like, but you know what I'm saying? Like, but what about my 19-year-old son
Exactly.
who experiences those things? And even though I teach him, that doesn't mean he'll know what to do. He might panic. He might reach for something just out of sheer fear. Not to mention what I go through as a Black mother who cannot sleep if my son isn't here, because I am afraid that he will have law enforcement contact and not know what to do. That anxiety, that stress, the mental health of that, which goes unaddressed for many of us. It's not talked about. And to add to that, the microaggressions that we experience based on that level of stress, because others don't understand what I go through as a Black mother, that I am not able to raise my son the way a white woman can raise her son. That's just a fact. That's the reality of it, period. And I have a really quick situation where I posted on my personal Facebook page about an experience about my son and how I teach his friends know your rights. I had just watched The Way They See Us, the documentary about the Central Park Five, and I was livid that none of those boys knew enough to ask for a lawyer, which is why I am very passionate that everywhere I go, I teach know your rights. So every time my son and his friends are here, we have the conversation. What you gonna do when the police stop you? Because they're going to stop you, period, right? They're going to stop you. So let's rehearse, let's role play, and I do that. And at the end of the post, I commented that I was afraid for my son to go with his friends that night on graduation night because I was too afraid that they would have law enforcement contact, and I just don't want that. And so someone in my office, I work at the Contra Costa District Attorney's Office in Martinez, screenshotted my post, sent it to every police officer association in the county. They then proceeded to call my office and complain that I was unprofessional, unethical, because I would suggest that my son would be racially profiled. I have had a hit piece recently from redstate.com about my personal Facebook page and my views about my son. The anxiety of that, not even knowing who shared my post, but I have to go to work with these people who I know they may smile in my face, but they're really not for me, right? And so I'm really big now, because we're going through a lot of stuff at the DA's office. I'm sure people have read it in the paper, that if you cannot support me if you stand in silence. I have a lot of people that'll come up to me and privately and be like, I support you. But if you're silent and you're not vocal and you're not, then you don't support me. And so I think personally, on a personal level, what we all need to do is have the courage to speak up, have the courage to be bias interrupters. Because there are so many things that go on a daily basis that impact people of color and have a tremendous effect on our quality of life, our stress level, our mental health, that go unaddressed. And a lot of us feel like we're alone. There aren't that many of us in the office to begin with. So to have to go to work and not know who you can trust or who you can even talk to or vent to, it's kind of like an island.
And those are the kinds of conversations we must have with our friends. Because Nichelle, I'm a woman of color. And yet when I talked with a Black lawyer friend just recently about her experiences, and I shared this with you before, of walking into a store and having her purse held high and making eye contact with the clerk and making sure that the clerk knew she was walking around, and then not wanting to buy a good sports car that she wanted because of her teenage son would want to take it out, and the possibilities of him getting stopped would be really a lot. I thought, I've never, even as a woman of color who's been discriminated, who's been stereotyped, I've never had those kinds of feelings. And so each one of us has to really stop and find out what our friends are living through and understand that and walk in those shoes and recognize that our experiences, even though they may be similar in some cases, are so different in so many ways. And I wanted to pick up on something that Adrienne said about policy. Policy is absolutely the first step in making change, but it isn't the only step. Because I was in South Africa last summer, And if you haven't been to South Africa, this is a trip you must all take. I went there for the big 5 animals. I learned about apartheid, and I came back with so much information. It was shocking to me what apartheid had done and what they have done and where they are in South Africa, and the inhumanity that people have with other people. They kept telling me, oh, you've been working at it for 200 years in the US, so you've got it right. And I said, we don't have it right. And they'll say, well, we've only been at it 25 years, but we have all our policies in place. And so they have in South Africa changed the laws, changed policies to battle apartheid. What hasn't changed are the hearts and minds of the people. And that's what I found so surprising and really quite depressing, is even though they have beautiful policies, they've got the beautiful Constitution Hall, there's still discrimination. You go downtown, all you see are Africans. You go in the rich houses, there's nobody there that looks like a person of color. And every house had barbed wire to keep anybody who was a criminal out of it. It was shocking, the disparities that still happen. So even with all the policies in place, the hearts and minds of the people had not yet changed. And that's where we need to go. Hearts and minds of people to make change after our policies are in place.
And Ruthe, if I could just add something, I wanted to point out, because I think you made a very good point there when you were talking about your experience in South Africa. Anti-Black racism is not just something that happens at the hands of law enforcement. Black people experience racism all over this country. And I'll give you another example. I went shopping several years ago, and I had shared this with the panel, to buy some new suits. I had put on some weight. I couldn't fit in my suits anymore, so I had to get some new clothes. And I went to a nice shop. I had both of my parents with me so they could help me pick some stuff out. Nobody would give us the time of day. So usually my experience when I go shopping, people are either following me around constantly because they think I'm going to steal something, or they just completely ignore me because they think I have no money. And I was really frustrated. We had been to several shops. Nobody would give us the time of day. And I stood in the middle of this men's clothing store. Sorry, it's a bit frustrating, but I stood in the I stood in the middle of this men's clothing store with my parents. We had been to several shops. Nobody would give us the time of day. And I screamed in the middle of the store. And I said, I'm a rich Black man and I want to buy some suits. Will anybody help me? And finally, somebody came over and I bought 5 suits. But it's so frustrating because you feel like I'm finally educated. You know, I went to good schools. I'm at a good firm. I've accomplished all these amazing things in my career, and I still can't even buy a suit because when people see the color of my skin, they think I'm a Black guy who has no money. So these are the kinds of injustices that we're still experiencing today in 2020. And so I just had to share that.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think, you know, listening to your stories, what's stunning is the extremes, both the type of racism that threatens your life and your physical safety, and the experiences that just destroy your soul and your humanity. You know, you may say, well, you know, not, you know, the things they say to me or do to me while I'm shopping seems like a small thing compared to losing your life. But the fact that that the discrimination that people face spans the whole breadth of it is just stunning. And, you know, I know that within the Latinx community, there is always the fear of being picked up by immigration or ICE. And it doesn't matter if you're a citizen. you don't really carry papers that say you're a citizen unless you walk around with your passport. And I know my brother, who would work during the summer in a clock shop down in LA, he would routinely get round up and be taken away. And now the ICE camps are just deadly. There's separation of children from parents. And anytime, that and the police violence all, I think, comes from a refusal or an inability to see us as human beings and to see our full humanity. And that's why you then get the other treatment of, well, this, I'm not going to let this person shop, or the other types of situations we encounter. It's because they just don't see us fully as full human beings who deserve the rights and respect. And that's the hearts and mind piece that Ruthe was talking about, that we need to figure out how to get over.
And not to mention, Professor Ontiveros, the many victims of domestic violence and sexual assault who are afraid to report because they're being terrorized, and that's held over their heads that they're going to call ICE if they report it to the police. So they can't even seek help. They're afraid to come to court. They're afraid to testify. They're afraid to get out of an abusive situation where they're being tortured, sexually assaulted, because they're afraid of ICE. And they're like, and if they do come forward and testify, then it's always used like, oh, they just want to get a U visa. That's used against them. Or, and my biggest pet peeve is that they come to the prosecution office and none of the prosecutors speak Spanish. Like, it's insane. Like, it's insane. It's insane. No, there's not one Spanish speaking attorney in Contra Costa.
Wow, that is insane. And in addition to being in fear for your body at the hand and potentially dying at the hands of the police, and also facing discrimination when going shopping and living your life, we can't leave this discussion without talking about housing discrimination, without talking about residential segregation, without talking about homelessness, which is rampant in the state of California, especially in the Bay Area. And we have to also examine the government's involvement in this. I'm currently reading a book called The Color of Law by an amazing person. I'm sure you guys have all heard about him. His last name is Rothstein. And he discusses the government's involvement in housing. And I studied urban planning as an undergrad. I have a master's in urban planning as well. And just what I've learned in this book is just, I didn't even know all of the high level of federal government involving in promoting segregation and refusing to back mortgages where neighborhoods would be integrated or where African Americans would reside. And so the experiences that we as people of color, as Black people, as Latino people, as Asian people have is really something that is unprecedented. And we have to continue to educate people. And again, we have to continue to push the boundaries, because we cannot live in a country that claims equality for all whenever most of us are segregated, face racism day in and day out.
And I heard something last night at the Bassiv Gala in one of the chat rooms hosted by our amazing past president, Kathy Ungiri. One of the panelists said, like, you have to talk less and listen more, and you have to actually do the work. You have to do your research. A one-time diversity training is not enough. You have to read the books. You have to educate yourself and listen about what is going on.
Hamilton actually said, Aaron Burr actually says, smile less, listen more. But I like the talk less, listen more, change. Yeah.
Yeah. And
so
Nichelle,
true.
I want to just skip ahead a few questions because I think you hit on an important issue. But before I do that, I want to address my co-moderator, Terrance. Thank you so much for having the courage and the strength to share that. with all of us and being willing to be vulnerable, because it's something we all needed to hear. It's something I needed to hear. It's an experience, multiple experiences that you had that I will never experience just because of the color of my skin. And, you know, hearing it and seeing its impact on you all these years later, it really did move me. And I just wanted to let you know that I heard you and I felt you. And I appreciate you.
Thank you, my friend. I appreciate that.
Nichelle, going to your point about how diversity training is not a one-off thing. It's something that's a process. It has to be undertaken with sincerity over time. You know, we've all heard recently that the Trump administration has called diversity training un-American and has gone so far as to direct federal agencies not to provide training on racial sensitivity. What do you view as the long-term impacts and consequences of this directive, and what is the solution?
Me directly?
Anyone on the panel.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that one.
The solution is the vote in November.
That's an immediate solution. And because, yeah, so everyone vote, please. But diversity work really started seriously about 30 years ago, in about 1986. And at that time, no one really said the word pipeline. No one talked about diversity. But there were a few people in the ABA and in California who thought that we really needed to build what Maria said, more people who would look and reflect the population that lawyers served. And that's when the first Commission on Racial and Ethnic Diversity was started at the ABA. At that time, there was so little hope of change. Well, there were two camps. There was a lot of hope that things would change, and then there was, oh yeah, this thing is so ingrained, it's not going to change. Well, all these years later, the needle has moved so little. We're still talking about it. I thought I would not have to do diversity work, that it would be done in my career as a lawyer. We really haven't moved the needle. We've moved maybe from 18% lawyers of color. It hovered between 16 and 18% for years in California. Now I'm told we're up to 20% lawyers of color in a state that is over 60% people of color. So, you know, Trump is just kind of a barrier, but we've had so many barriers in the last 30 to 35 years that I still have hope in the generations that are coming up. My work is just about done. I'm in the sunset of my career, but the next generation of Adrian, the next generation of Will, the next generation of your kids that are more biracial, that are more involved, that are more looking beyond skin color to what people are. I have high hope for those, well, maybe millennials are beyond that, but the X, Y, and Z generation, they are the ones that change the world. And I will always have hope that someday all of our talk and all of our work will no longer be needed.
And I agree, Ruthe. I think I've said before that this is such an amazing time in which there's both the most open and violent racism going on, but also hope for change. I mean, the fact that people are, for the first time, really, I think, starting to have discussions about anti-Black racism. You know, the fact that we are saying the names of our Black brothers and sisters who've been lynched and murdered at the hands of the police. And the fact that that's actually in the discourse of society in an open way is something that I've never seen before. That gives me hope. The Supreme Court case Bostock, which finally said that there can't be discrimination against lesbian women and gay men and transgender people. I've always told my students, sometime in your lifetime, you will see that change in Title VII. I don't think I'm going to see it in my lifetime, but you'll see it in yours. And when that opinion came down, I got so many emails from former students saying that, yes, it's happened. So I do think that there's hope, but that it is also such a treacherous and dangerous time at the same time. And I think, diversity training is important. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think that companies are smart enough to know that regardless of what Trump says, that if they don't have those programs, they aren't going to be able to claim some very strong affirmative defenses that they're going to want in discrimination claims. So I don't see those going anywhere. But at the same time, the one-off trainings don't work. I think one thing that does make a big difference, and Nichelle used the term before, is when we play the role of bias interrupters. And I think it's so important that people who are relatively privileged play that role. That if I, as a professor, can step in and bring my lived experience and find a way to interrupt microaggressions in the classroom, that's going to help my students of color not have to deal with as much trauma. As Nichelle said, it's really hard to continue your law studies when you are suffering microaggression after microaggression after microaggression, and it can't be all on them to stand up to their classmates. I think those of us who have some power need to become more comfortable being individual bias interrupters. And we may do that in different ways. We may do that through humor. We may do that through education. We were talking the other day, and I made an impassioned pitch to one of my colleagues yesterday. She was discussing some other types of committee work that she was on. But yeah, sometimes being a bias interrupter means making other people uncomfortable in a very open way. And I think that is something that we can do, when we are feeling our power and when we have that relative power, that can be very helpful.
Professor Ontiveros, go ahead.
I was going to say, I feel like it's also having the courage to do it, because you may get pushback from those around you, but it's having the courage to do it. I am blessed to not have a filter. That's a blessing sometimes and not always, but I push back, right? But because I push back and because I speak my mind, I'm often labeled as aggressive or abrasive. And that term was actually put in one of my performance reviews. And I challenged it. I refuse because the white guy next to me is aggressive. He is abrasive, and he's championed as an amazing trial lawyer. So I refuse to be, you don't get to use those words, because I challenge what you say, and so, but that could affect my career, right? But I just don't care, right? But you have to have the courage to be a bias interrupter. And I often do it with humor. I had a judge tell me once that I remind him of Cookie from Empire. I think he thought that he was relating to me. And I just was like, Cookie? Like, I kind of clutched my pearls. And he was telling me how his wife loved the show, whatever. And I was like, I actually hate that show. And I said, I'm more of a Cersei type of girl, Game of Thrones. So I kind of used humor. So it kind of pushed him back a little bit, like, sir, don't do that. I've had a judge tell me before, no offense, Ms. Holmes, but the brother's got the best barbecue. I'm like, I don't know what brother you're talking about, because my brother cannot cook at all, sir. But it's those types of things, like, what? And so it's having but a lot of times you're just silent. You don't know what to say, especially younger attorneys. They're kind of stuck. They don't know what to say. And so sometimes it takes somebody else to step in and be the bias interrupter. And you could do that a whole bunch of ways.
If I could ask a follow-up question on being a bias interrupter, one thing that is sometimes uncomfortable to talk about is racism is not always white versus people of color, we have racism within our own respective communities, and there are racial tensions between the Black, the Asian, the Latino communities, and back and forth. And there are a number of efforts that are made, especially with this upcoming election, to divide us instead of unite us. How do we deal with racism that we have against each other in our respective communities? And I'm not talking about us on this panel, but I'm talking about our respective communities. How do we address that so that we can come together as one people as opposed to being divided? And I don't know, perhaps Professor Ontiveros, if you have some thoughts on how do we deal with the racism within our respective communities.
And I think everyone else probably has some wonderful ideas as well. I think it gets back to developing empathy, explaining what the common forms of oppression are, right? If you can, some people have difficulty asking, how do you even start these conversations with your family? Or how do you start these conversations with certain groups that you're involved in? And I think, unfortunately, we all peoples of color have suffered different kinds of oppression. And if you can start by saying, when someone treats, assumes that you are a babysitter, right? I open the door, right? I don't have on my nice work clothes. I'm there. There's an assumption, I live in a nice house, right? Are you the babysitter? I need to talk to the person who lives here. I'm like, well, I am the person who lives here, right? And that can be a very common experience for Latinas. And say, now understand that is something that can translate to Nichelle's shopping experience, right? So we can talk about the types of similarities, right? The concerns that you have of some of your relatives being swooped up and taken away. That concern for physical safety is akin to this concern about having a police officer take your life. So to try and to emphasize to people that we all face oppression, and it's parallel, to try to develop empathy to understand what those connections are, and then to understand that it's not a competition. It's not, we're not the ones that are all competing for the same pie. If we're not getting ahead, it's not because y'all are getting ahead as well. It's because there's somebody else with a lot more power that is keeping us from getting there. So those are just some of my thoughts, but I'm sure the rest of the panel has other things.
Thank you for that, Professor Ontiveros. I would like to add that in addition to what you just said, I think that we have to call it out whenever we see it in our respective communities. So if someone is making comments that are rude, or saying, well, and this has happened to several people that I know, and even to me, well, you're cute for a Black girl, right? Like, who says this? Or to my cousin, who was a darker skinned person, oh, you're cute for a dark skinned Black girl. And immediately, whenever I hear things like that, I'm like, what do you mean? What does that mean? What you're really saying is racist, and you need to stop that immediately. And even going to like hair texture, like, oh, you have nice hair. And I challenge that when people say that. What does nice even mean? What does that mean? Like, when you're saying that someone's hair is nice or good or bad, you have internalized a very Eurocentric view of hair, appearance, and beauty. And so it's up to you to call it out as you see it and as you go, and to not buy into that, right? We cannot buy into a Eurocentric standard of beauty. Everyone has beauty, no matter what part of the world you're from, and we need to accept that and embrace that. So calling it out whenever you see it. And I see that was one of the questions that someone posted, like, how do you do this? How do you go about being a bias interrupter? Calling it out, calling things out immediately when you see them.
One of the things that's always said about Asian American Pacific Islanders, or Asian Pacific Islanders, or Asian Pacific Americans, or wherever you want to call us, is, I just forgot what I was going to say. Oh, you speak the language so well. Or, you've seen one, you see them all. So there's hard differentiation between who's Chinese, who's Japanese, who's Korean, who's Filipino, who's Indonesian. And they all get lumped into the same arena. So with all the different cultures and all the different generations that are here, the Chinese Americans built the railroads in California. The Filipino Americans were the first fishermen in New Orleans. So there are generations of Asian Pacific Americans who have been here for hundreds of years. And then there's the newer immigrants who have come with totally different views, totally different political leanings, totally different values sometimes. And how you get all lumped into one pot is sometimes very difficult. One example right now is Proposition 209. Proposition 209, the affirmative action proposition that was passed in 1996. It now has, there's a proposition on the California ballot called Proposition 16 that will be seeking to repeal Proposition 209. Proposition 209 hit all of us. But most of you know that there's a real divide in the Asian American community about which side to be on for Proposition 16 and which side to be on for Proposition 209. We don't have enough time on this program to go into all of those subtleties, but that's one of the things that our communities face is how do you deal with such different diverging views? And I think what is trying to happen right now is both sides are talking to each other. And like Hamilton said, you talk less, you listen more, and you try to be in the room where decisions are made and where policies are made, and you speak up. But it's that collaboration, the communication, the connection, finding the common ground where you can all agree, and then moving out to those places where you disagree and see if there's enough common ground to come to some sort of solution. As lawyers, we know mediation, we know arbitration, we know how to resolve problems. I think we go back to our lawyering skills when we talk between our communities to try to get to common ground and make it so that there's one voice, or at least try to be one voice. And if not that, try to understand the other's point of view.
Ruthe,
I think we should also add the LGBT community in there.
Absolutely.
Ruthe, I'm glad you hit on the Prop 16 issue, because actually one of our members of the audience raised that issue, observing that many opponents of, allowing affirmative action are Asian American organizations, as something that you noted. And I would like to address that a little bit and get the panel's thoughts on that. And Professor Ontiveros, you addressed this as well. I think that the opposition by and among Asian Americans to the notion of affirmative action is rooted in the model minority myth. This, benign stereotype that Asian Americans, oh, look at them, they work hard, they follow the rules, they do everything right, and they'll keep doing that. And, that's what all the other minority groups should aspire to be. And for me, I've always hated that very notion because it's so toxic. Because the model minority myth is not something that the Asian American community should hold on to. It's something you should reject affirmatively, because it is just another weapon to divide the minority communities and reinforce the white supremacist power structure that says, we'll create an enemy for everybody else. Like, here's who you need to be. But Asians, you're never going to be us. You're never going to be part of the power structure. So it's just another tactic to divide and conquer. And so when I see opposition to things like affirmative action, which are meant to kind of undo that systemic division and racism and discrimination, it's disappointing to me. And as a member of the Asian American community, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think if we're gonna, I'm really glad you brought that up. I mean, I think that, just speaking for myself and my observations of the Latino community, we often find much more common ground with the African American community. There's, I don't know if there's more shared, brown into black, or there's something I think often where we feel more kinship. Whereas I think that there is so much more work that needs to be done in building bridges between the Latino community and the Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander community. And, perhaps the way to do that is to focus on our immigrant histories and the way that's treated. But I think that that's a huge gap that is not one that has where there's been as much coalition building as before. And I think it's some place where we really need to do a lot of work. I do think, I've seen several panels on the affirmative action lawsuit that was brought against Harvard Law School and other law schools brought on behalf of Asian American plaintiffs. And it's very clear when you talk to the participants in that, who the real movers and shakers are behind that lawsuit. And it really isn't there to benefit the broader Asian American community. It is if they are being used as plaintiffs to attack affirmative action. And it's a different idea than the model minority myth, but it's, as you say, it's a way of being used and abused by the power structure that is not letting you in to the power structure at the same time. I mean, Ruthie's talked about, the phenomenally low, small percentage of Asian American attorneys and judges that are out there.
And Professor Ontiveros, if I could just add, a lot of folks, as we talk about connections between the Black community and the Latino community, a lot of folks don't realize that in many parts of the country, 25% or more of Latinos are Black. This is especially true on the East Coast. If you look at your Dominicans and your Puerto Ricans and even a lot of folks in Mexico, there's a large Black population. And sometimes there is ambiguity as to how those folks are classified. Sometimes Black Latinos do not want to be classified as Black. They want to be classified as Latino and vice versa. So there are those connections there. And I think it's important that we find ways to build those, because I think we're so much stronger together. Another thing that I think is important as we talk about Prop 16 and affirmative action, a lot of folks, when they think about reparations and affirmative action, they're only thinking about slavery. And the impact of Jim Crow on the Black community and people of color is far beyond that. And I just wanted to point out just a few examples, and I'll be very brief here, of the impact of Jim Crow on the Black community and people of color. And this is right in California. And this is from a presentation that I did on Juneteenth just a few months ago. But Jim Crow laws in California, and these were in effect for about 100 years in California, from 1850 to about 1950, 1947. They barred non-whites from testifying in any case where a white person was a party. So it didn't matter if it was a car accident, it didn't matter if it was a property dispute, it didn't matter what it was, non-whites could not testify against whites. Non-white people in California for 100 years could not serve on a jury. Non-white people in California, I'm not talking about Mississippi, Alabama, California, were barred from voting, were barred from holding elective office, were barred from serving as judges. Non-white attorneys for 100 years in California were barred from questioning white witnesses. So if you were an attorney and you had a white witness on the other side that you wanted to question, you were barred from asking any white witness a question. So you can imagine the impact that had on being a white, an attorney of color. Non-white lawyers, non-white people were barred from attending public schools in California. They were barred from buying and renting property in certain areas. You had redlining. This is why you have Black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods and Asian neighborhoods. It didn't just happen because folks decided, hey, we all want to live together. There were laws that specifically prohibited Black people and Asian people and Latino people from living in certain neighborhoods in California. You could not buy property there. There were codes on the books that prevented you from doing so, and you couldn't get financing, okay? Non-white people were barred from being buried in certain cemeteries. The Inglewood Cemetery in Los Angeles is one of the largest cemeteries in California. I have family there, but for many decades, non-whites were prevented from being there. Non-white people could not go to restaurants in California, could not go to hotels in California, could not go to theaters in California, could not use swimming pools, could not use beaches. A lot of folks wonder why Black people have proficiency in swimming at far less rates than many other races. Well into the 70s, Black people were barred from public swimming pools that were open to other races. They were barred from using beaches. So many Black people for generations didn't get the opportunity to swim. They were barred from bar associations. Folks wonder, why do we have so many affinity bar associations? Why do you have a Black bar association and a Latino bar association and an Asian Pacific bar association? Why isn't there just one? It's because the American Bar Association and many other predominantly white bar associations refused for admittance for over 100 years for people of color to be there. That's why we have these organizations. Non-white people couldn't use public transportation in California for 100 years. We couldn't use public transportation. And we were denied equal pay for equal work. So it didn't matter if you had the same job description. You could not get paid the same. You also didn't accrue seniority the same. And a lot of folks don't realize that the Civil Rights Act that was passed had provisions in there that kept that in place. And then we also know about the miscegenation law. So when we talk about affirmative action, we're talking about hundreds of years, not just slavery, but the Jim Crow and the impact that had on communities of color for generations. I know there's some other questions in the chat. I don't know if, Will, you saw some other great questions that you wanted to ask. I know there is a question about starting conversations with people who may not be sympathetic to the issue of systematic racism or discrimination. How do you engage with people who just don't understand? And I don't know if Will and other folks on the panel, if you have some ideas on how to approach people who think very differently than us.
I was actually in that situation just about 6 weeks ago when I was with some of my girlfriends who I raised children with in Southern California. And we were talking about the George Floyd death. And one of my girlfriends said to me, why are we talking about Black Lives Matter? All lives matter, not just Black Lives Matter. And it took me aback because I'm not usually in a situation where somebody says that to me. I must surround myself with people who many times think like me. And I had to stop and take stock and remember that she had been a friend for 40 years and I wasn't going to yell and scream at her, but I needed to educate her on why. And when you talk about systemic racism, Terrance, going all the way back, China's Exclusion Act was what affected my father, who had to leave here when he was a cook to go back home to find a wife in the Philippines. So I took a few deep breaths and I started off with, I understand where you're coming from, but let me show you a different point of view. And I sort of went through a historical review of, as I tried to help her explain why Black Lives Matter, and then shared some very personal experiences with her, experiences that I'd been shared with my friends who were Black, experiences that I had gone through. And at the end of a 45-minute monologue, where everyone was quiet, they all looked at me and they said, "Oh, I've never heard that before." I don't know if I changed their hearts and minds, but I think I educated them. But it was a shock for me to be in that situation. So that's how I, on the fly, did it. I think it may have worked with a little education, with a little bit of educating, but I don't know if I brought them to my side.
There's a question, and it says, many of us work with and have a and have to collaborate with people who deny that systematic racism exists. Any suggestions on how to maneuver in those spaces?
Nichelle, I think that's something that you hit on earlier, is that, and also Professor Ontiveros, people have different ways of responding to those types of situations. The people who are just, as Ruthe pointed out, just ignorant. They don't know what they don't know. And you highlighted one way to address it was through humor. I actually had an interesting experience of my own dealing with that issue. This was about 4 years ago now, just before the 2016 election. And I was a, still, relatively young attorney, mid-level associate at a law firm. And I was at a client meeting with 3 older white men, all of whom are older than me, one associate, a partner, and the client. And we were all, liberal, progressive people, out here in the Bay Area. And we were talking about a lot of the overheated and very troubling and frankly racist rhetoric that was coming out of the Trump campaign at that time, leading up to the 2016 election. And as we were talking about it, the other associate in the room, again, an older white male, he made a comment. He said, we're talking about this, but I really don't think that racism is that big of an issue in this country anymore. And I just shot him the nastiest glance and blurted out without even thinking, "That's really easy to say when you're white." And I said it a lot more harshly than I did just now. You could hear a pin drop in that room for a good solid maybe 5 seconds as these 3 older white men were looking at me like, where in the hell did that come from? And then, it was one of those things where you kind of freeze because you have an opportunity to course correct or change your mind or say something or say sorry, but I just kept staring until everybody just kind of moved on and we started talking about other things. And I think that was a unique feature of being biracial. I identify strongly with my Asian American heritage. I'm half Chinese, very proud of it. But because of the way I look and because of my name, I pass for white, and you hear some things from people that you might not expect them to say in front of others. But there's absolutely the dynamic of just denying systemic racism because they've never seen it, they've never felt it. That's why they need to hear stories like what Terrance shared with us. Because even for me, it was incredibly moving and raw, and I felt deeply unsettled and deeply moved by your comments. And so I think, maybe I didn't handle that situation the best way. It was just my knee-jerk reaction to hearing something that I found so patently absurd, to think that there's not an issue of systemic racism in this country anymore. And I think that the people who make those kinds of comments need to sit down with people like who we have on this panel and sit down with Terrance and listen to what people experience every single day to really understand.
Well, sometimes I was just going to say there have been times I've been in situations where I did not feel empowered to speak up about racism that I saw right in front of me. And just a very quick example, this was just a couple of years ago. I was going to be preparing a CEO of a company for their deposition. And it was a matter that I had worked on for nearly 2 years. And apparently this gentleman had never looked me up. It's not hard. I'm pretty active on social media. And I think if you see my picture, there's no question that I'm a Black man. But he had never looked me up, apparently. And we had many conversations on the phone, many emails. And so he was at our office so that I could greet him and take him into the prep room to get him ready for his deposition. And I walk in and I said, "Mr. So-and-so, it's so nice to see you here. And we're going to get ready for your deposition prep." And he's like, "Oh my God, you're Terrance Evans?" And I said, "Yeah. You're Terrance Evans." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "But you're Black and you don't sound Black on the telephone." And I just listened, and he continued to make a big deal about the fact that he didn't think that I sounded Black and he never would have thought that I was Black. And throughout the deposition prep, he kept making all kinds of comments like, wow, you're Black and you really know what you're doing and you understand all of this. And I'm thinking in my head, I've been doing this for almost 2 decades, so I would hope that I would understand what I'm doing by now, but I was very polite. I just kind of brushed it off because I didn't want to disrupt the attorney-client relationship. This was an important client, so I just kind of pushed it off. And even after his deposition, he's like, wow, you really did a great job in there. You handled it well, and you're a Black guy. He's like, wow, that's really amazing. And I never said anything. I just kind of brushed it off. And there are times when you are a person of color where you don't feel empowered to say something, and somebody who is an ally is in a better position to speak up. And I've had the opportunity to be an ally. So I was in a mediation. It was a large construction defect case. There were 2 women lawyers in a room with about 30 plus male lawyers. And the mediator, I thought, was very sexist and very disrespectful to these 2 women. Very condescending, just not paying attention to what they're saying. And I took the mediator aside and I said, what you're doing is not cool, it's not appropriate, and I don't like how you're disrespecting these women. I said, you need to show them respect. And I got loud and people heard me. I was very frustrated with what this mediator was doing, and I just couldn't sit there quietly while he disrespected these women in front of this room full of men. So I got the opportunity as a Black man to stand up, and both of these women were white, to stand up for 2 white women and say, hey, you're not gonna disrespect them like this in this mediation. So you can be a person from a minority group and stand up for somebody else. You can be a woman and stand up for a man or somebody from the LGBT. It doesn't matter. We all can be allies to each other, and we all should be allies for our respective communities. That is where the real strength comes in. If you see somebody who's being mistreated, abused, taken advantage of, and they don't feel empowered because they're afraid that they could lose their job or lose a client or whatever, you stand up if you feel empowered to do so and you say something.
And I was going to add too, so there's 2 questions in here. One about how you navigate the spaces where systematic people don't acknowledge that systematic racism exists. And then there's another question about how do you, the issue of implicit bias as it relates to the judiciary and how you can, be a bias interrupter in that space. So for me, I'm a district attorney and I'm in court all the time, and I'm very intentional about what I do. I'm very intentional about the types of cases that I will prosecute. And if I feel like there's any type of discrimination, any type of racial profiling, I call it out. I call it out to the officers. I bring it to my supervisor. If I feel like something is just not right, I speak up on it. I won't prosecute a case that I don't feel ethically tied to. If I feel like there's some type of discrimination or something, I bring it up. And I had a case where a guy was arrested, pulled over for a taillight. Of course, they searched him. He had 2 Vicodin in his pocket because he had been shot. He still had the bullet in him and he didn't have health insurance. And they charged him with a possession of a controlled substance. I just don't think that is a good thing that we should be prosecuting. Like that's ridiculous. He doesn't have health care. And his girlfriend was in the car and she had a prescription for the Vicodin and she had given them to him. Now I get that you're not supposed to be taking other people's Vicodin, but when you're underprivileged, you're lower income, you don't have health insurance, and you got a bullet in you, I'm gonna need a couple of them Vicodin. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I am just not ethically going to prosecute that case, and I call it out. So I'm very intentional. I'm very intentional about African Americans on the jury. I had a case. It was a very serious life case, a torture case. The defendant and the victim were African American, and I had an African American juror, or he was a prospective juror, who had been falsely imprisoned and spent 5 months in jail. He was later exonerated by his cell phone. So he obviously has had a negative experience with law enforcement. Every person in my office was like, you need to boot him. You need to boot him. Absolutely not. Because I don't know a Black man in America that don't have a negative experience with law enforcement. That doesn't disqualify him from being a qualified juror. It just doesn't. I kept him on my jury. He was the foreperson of that jury and was able to bring that case home. He was amazing. I had the conversation with him afterwards because he was surprised that I kept him, but I knew that he would understand. He would be able to relate. It had nothing to, the case didn't have anything to do with the police. It was this person who was torturing this other person. And then I'm always in situations where there is implicit bias or the judge says something out of line, and I am intentional and I will make a record. And I had a judge in that very same case. We were arguing over whether or not the victim had consented to the defendant branding her on her back with a metal pole that he had stuck on an open fire, and he branded his initial in her back. So it was a mayhem charge, whether she had agreed to that. Her acquiescence was consent. And so the judge literally said, well, I see on TV all the time, these athletes, you know, they got the brands on their arm, like obviously they consented to that. And I'm like, literally, like about to lose my job, like literally. Like, are you seriously comparing my domestic violence victim to an somebody who's in a fraternity? Like, are you really doing that, sir? Like that. So I was so mad that day, I could not talk. So I had to address it later. So I asked, could we recess and come back the next day? Because I needed a timeout. And so I came back the next day, and when I addressed it, Your Honor, I'd like to address, here's the case law. Like yesterday, when you analogized my victim to that of someone in an African-American fraternity, and as soon as I said that, he lost it. What are you talking about? I never did that. I didn't even bring up race. What are you talking about? Like that, you're wrong. And I was like, well, from my perspective, that's what you were doing. And he said, well, your perspective is wrong. And he argued me down. I let him finish. And then I made my record. Your Honor, I am African-American. I went to a historically Black college. And in where I'm from, people who have brands on their arm, they're probably a member of a fraternity, because branding is an initiation ritual in many of the fraternities. So you have the Omegas, the Alphas, and they have brands on their arm. Mind you, the person who branded them, it was probably a consensual situation. But that is very different from what we have here. I would analogize this situation to a slave owner who brands his property, or modern day to a trafficker, a human trafficker who brands his victim as his property. Like, so from what you said, this is my perspective as an African-American. Like he's listening now because he can get that as an African-American, I have a totally different experience than you. So when you start talking about athletes who have brands on them, in my experience, you're probably talking about an African-American who is a member of some fraternity, who got a brand when they were in college, because that's my experience. So then he said, because he's a white man, oh, well, what college did you go to? So I said, I graduated from Spelman. He was like, oh, I went to one of these hoity-toity schools called Stanford. So then he tells me about his experience at Stanford. So when he got done, and I said, one last thing, Your Honor, for the record, Spelman is pretty hoity-toity too. So that's how I interrupt bias. I always call it out. If it happens in front of me, I'm making a record. Like, you have to have the courage. And you gotta be ready for whatever that comes with that. But at some point, it has to change. And if you're never going to say anything, you're never going to be willing to accept the consequences. I mean, think back in civil rights. Somebody had to have the courage to stand up and to be willing to accept whatever came with that. And that's just where I am. I'm passionate about that. I don't care where we are. I'm very intentional about, trying to humanize the defendants. I call them by their name, Mr. and Mrs., right? And so those are ways that I interrupt that bias in the courtroom.
Thank you for doing that, Nichelle.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it looks like we're reaching the end of our time. And so I was going to ask folks to start giving us their final words of wisdom. We will, by the way, email the folks who registered the information for the upcoming events. So I'll make sure you get that. But if you can start, Professor Ontiveros, giving us your words of wisdom as we get ready to wrap up.
Okay, I guess I will just comment on, yes, the importance of intentionality. I bring race and issues of systemic racism when I teach torts, when I teach evidence, and I get blowback from that because people think, well, that doesn't have anything to do with those courses. It's fine in your employment discrimination course, but it doesn't belong there. but the need to do that is important. And then the other thing I want to say is, in terms of how do you explain systemic racism, oftentimes my students of color get it. So I'm often trying to just inform my white students or students who don't get it. And I have found focusing in on theories of privilege are theories that resonate very much with them. And I say, because it's a way of kind of taking the sting out of it and saying, it's not your fault that we have a racist institutional, a racist institution in our society, but you need to recognize it. And you need to recognize that the people who developed the system developed it in a way that works well for them and doesn't work well for others. And I just conclude often with the fishbowl analogy, which is that if you were a human and you were tossed into a fishbowl, all you would focus on all day is how to breathe, because you couldn't breathe underwater. Whereas the fish would constantly want to know, why are you so focused on breathing? What is your problem? We've got gills, it's not an issue. And that oftentimes, if you wonder, why is it that people of color are always talking about race because it's not an issue, it's because we're in a system and in a society where we can't breathe and that it's not comfortable. And that they have to recognize that whoever has developed the system developed it in a way that maybe works for them and for people in power, but that doesn't work for us. And those are some ways that I try to teach about systemic racism.
Ruthe, can you, and thank you so much, Professor Ontiveros. Ruthe, can you also share with us some of your words of wisdom?
Sure, I think change has to begin with me. And it has to begin with each one of us. And we have to be intentional about it. I really like that word, intentional. We have to talk less, listen more. We have to become mentors. We have to start nonprofits. We have to march. But it starts with us. Unless we understand and unless we know and unless we walk in the walk and walk in the shoes of our brothers and sisters, we really aren't any use. But also, when we're talking about the future, I think we need to build the future more intentionally, and that's where I like to use the word pipeline. Maria talked about populating our legal profession with people who look more like us, with people who reflect the people in California that we serve, the people across the nation that are turning more majority minority. Let's work with our students, because that's where we can make an impact. I wish we could start with preschoolers, but we haven't gotten the money or the funds or the structure to go down that far. But we have started with high school students to introduce them to careers in the law, to law-related careers where they can be police officers. So we've got a diverse police force. They can be court administrators, they can be paralegals, they can be lawyers. And for students in high school to have somebody that looks like them, who has the same experience that they had, to get up there and say, I was sitting in your seat at one time, and now I'm here. You can live your dream. You can become whatever you want to become. And at least have them explore areas where they can be part of the leadership of this country. Because we don't grow lawyers, we grow leaders. So I think we focus on the pipeline and we start with ourselves, and then we make change in our organizations.
Thank you. And Adrieannette, can you please share with us your words of wisdom?
Sure, and I really want to echo everything that Professor Ontiveros and Ruthe has just said. You know, we have to be honest with ourselves. We are living in a pandemic where the highest number of people who are dying are brown and Black people. And my uncle passed away. We buried him the weekend of Labor Day weekend. And COVID is real. Racism is real. Racism is real from the time we wake up to the time we go to sleep. If we look at someone with the case of Breonna Taylor, who was sleeping in her house, she was murdered, right? So we have to start by being real with ourselves and with one another with what's actually happening right now. be real with yourself, be real with other people, have a change of heart if these issues don't resonate with you. And, you know, everyone has a distinct part to play. One body is made up of several different parts. So as Ruthe mentioned, some people will be marching, other people will serve as mentors, other people will put people together. Whatever you feel like your calling is or your ministry is, like I like to say, you need to work at that. And we're here together. As long as the world as we know is ongoing, we have to work together and we have to create a better place for the future.
Thank you so much. And Nichelle, can you give us your final words of wisdom?
I also echo everything that everyone has said. Again, have the courage to make the change. It can be exhausting. All of us are exhausted, but as some of us, as you've heard, some of our experience, like our everyday life is exhausting. Like I am so tired of having to explain, but I will continue to explain because I know that perspective is definitely needed, and it has to start with us having discussions and sharing experiences. Have the courage to stand up and be a voice. Reach back. I wouldn't be where I am had it not been for my amazing network of mentors and people who believed in me, sometimes more than I believed in myself. I mentor, I go to schools and talk to students, I mentor young lawyers, I teach Know Your Rights everywhere I can. I'm involved in a bunch of different organizations, but that is because I have an obligation to my community to give back and to invest in them the same way they invested in me. I would not be in the position that I am had it not been for my community and my network of Black lawyers and judges. Like I just wouldn't. And so I just encourage every one of you to, even if it's just one thing, even if it means to join an affinity bar and go to an event or networking, like just start somewhere. Start somewhere.
Thank you. And my friend Will, can you give us your final words of wisdom?
You know, I didn't come here to share wisdom. I came here to listen and absorb the wisdom of this amazing panel. And you have all offered so much, and I'm so grateful to each one of you, including you, my friend, Terrance Evans, for what I was able to witness and hear and listen and absorb today. It was very moving, very powerful, I think, for everybody who attended. I also want to offer my gratitude to everybody who came to listen to this program and the dozens of you who have asked amazing, really thought-provoking questions that just really made this such a wonderful conversation about race and about justice. So no wisdom from me, just my heartfelt gratitude to all of you.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, all the members of the panel. All of you were incredible. I learned so much from all of you, was inspired by all of you. For all the folks who had questions we didn't get to, I apologize. This was a recorded program, so it will be available on the CLA Racial Justice website. And regarding our October 9th and October 15th events, we will email all the folks who registered for this program to make sure you have all of that information. And I also want to thank again all of the organizations, all the minority bars that sponsored this, and also CLA Racial Justice that sponsored this event. It wouldn't have happened without your support. And my final words is, I just want to thank everybody, and I want everybody to be encouraged. I think that if we work together, we can accomplish anything, and we're stronger together. So if we can all just come together, work hard together, love each other, we can make something happen. And for all the young Black boys and girls and men and women who are watching that, if someone like me was able to make it as far as I have, all of you can too. We're all representations of what all of you can be. Thanks so much, and have a wonderful night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.